Hey, what is good, everybody? Welcome back to Wick-it Rules. Today we're going to be going over 10 steps for mixing low end. And what were we talking about? Oh yeah, we all know that the low end is the most problematic part of the entire mix. And there's actually a good reason for that. And we're going to go over that and a whole lot more. So let's go. First off, let's talk about perceived loudness. And what that means is the way our ears work, we don't really hear things the way they really are in reality. We hear them the way our ears hear them. So check this out. I have a kick sample and a hi-hat sample. And when we listen to it, it sounds fairly balanced. Like if I was going to make a beat out of this kick and this hi-hat at this volume, sound like this. Sounds about right, somewhere in the neighborhood. But let's pull up a spectrum analyzer here, and I'm using the spectrum analyzer in Ableton. If you don't have one in whatever DAW you're using, go grab Voxingo Span. It's a free one. Let's look at what's really going on here. Our kick drum is peaking at about negative 16 dB, but the hi-hat is all the way down here peaking at about negative 40 dB. That means that this kick drum is 24 decibels louder than this hi-hat, but it's just not how we hear it. Simply put, we just don't hear bass very well, and we love it. So we have to really turn it up to make it sound balanced to our ears. And that's exactly why it muddies up a mix so quick, because we want a whole bunch of this thing that we don't hear too well. So to hear what this kick and hi-hat would actually sound like at the same volume, it would sound like this. Crazy, right? So if I pull up this spectrum, now in reality, those two elements are the exact same volume. They're both peaking at about negative 40 dB. But that's just not the way our ears work. The first research on all this was done in the 1930s. The telephone companies and the broadcast companies hired these two guys, Fletcher and Munson, to do research because they wanted to know what frequency range were human beings most sensitive to. And that turned out to be somewhere around 1 kilohertz through 5 kilohertz. The reason they wanted to know this information is because they wanted to figure out how little energy it would take to make a phone call audible or to make a broadcast audible. And the less energy they use to do it means more profits. And that's why old telephones didn't sound like this.
Hello?
Instead, they sounded like this.
Hello?
Money, money. So this research really had nothing to do with music initially, but it was eventually co-opted by producers and studio engineers and stuff. And there's something known as the Fletcher-Munson curve. And what that means, here's a fully mixed song.
Bring the bass up to the top. I like the beat get round up.
It's going to start up here with the sub-frequencies and the bass frequencies being the loudest. And it's going to kind of go this way. So if you take most songs, whatever style or genre, and you throw them up onto a spectrum analyzer like this, you're going to see this curve to a degree. And that's kind of what a balanced mix is going to look like. With the low frequencies way up here and the really high frequencies way down here, that sounds even to us. And that is the Fletcher-Munson curve and how it relates to perceived loudness. All right, moving on to number 2, and that is unwanted subfrequencies are everywhere. Right here, I've made a little top loop with a hi-hat, a snap, and a shaker. Now, it doesn't sound bassy. It doesn't sound like there's a whole lot of low end. But if we actually look at these, here's the hi-hat. Look at all that sub and bass frequency action going on right there. Same with the snap. Same with the shaker. And if you play all of this together and look at this spectrum analyzer, look how crowded all of this low end and sub frequency range is. And this is just a hi-hat and a snap and a shaker. This isn't even a kick drum or a bass line. So we haven't even introduced our low end elements to the track yet, and already we've got a super crowded house going on. And there's a possibility you might be sitting there messing with your kick drum and your bass, and you can't get the mix right, and it won't stop distorting, and no matter what you do, you can't figure out how to make it sound punchy and clean. There's a possibility that you kind of screwed yourself over on the front end with stuff like this. And this isn't just drums either. Look at this piano. Look at all that. This piano has a ton of sub-frequency and bass information, and pretty much everything does. And it might just be a little bit, but when you start getting like 15 tracks or 20 tracks in your song, if all those things have just a little bit of bass information, that adds up and it makes it really crowded. And so the answer to good punchy low end isn't just about the relationship between the kick and the bass. It's also about making sure that there was room for either one of those things in the first place. The solution's pretty simple. I'm just going to take my EQ and we're going to roll off these low frequencies. And when you do this, I try to be careful to not change what it actually sounds like. So I'm going to slowly start to roll this off. And whenever I can actually hear the piano like getting thinner and the sound changing, then I'm going to bring it back just a little bit. See right there, it's starting to sound thin. And let's do an A-B with the EQ. See, I can't really hear a difference. And I'm rolling it off around 120 hertz. So I'm not even really changing the way this piano sounds, but I'm still making all that room for the low end. And you know, that's what you would have to do on each one of these, like the hi-hat. On my first pass of rolling off low end, I like to not alter the way the sample or the instrument sounds. So all I'm doing on the first pass is just getting rid of all that unwanted bass and sub frequency, but not altering the sound of the element itself. So that'd be around there, and you have to just do this on everything. So now when we listen to this, it sounds pretty much exactly the same, except for we've really cleaned it up. And you just have to keep an eye on all your tracks because they are everywhere and they are unwanted. And that brings us to number 3, sidechain compression. All it really is, if I sidechain these keys to this kick, every time the kick hits, the volume of these keys is going to dip down, and then when the kick drum ends, the volume is going to come back up. And so it's basically just a way for things to make room for each other. Now, there's 2 main types of sidechaining that I want to go over just to be clear. There's using sidechain as an effect to where it's very noticeable and obvious. It kind of makes like a pumping effect. That's used a lot in like house music and anything 4 on the floor. So listen to this. If I take a compressor and put it on the synth, I'm going to put my compressor in sidechain mode. And right here where it says audio from, this kick drum is called kick 9. So I'm going to select kick 9 from this menu. And I'm going to turn my ratio all the way up to infinite, and that makes it a limiter basically. And I'm going to turn the attack all the way down. And I like to use RMS mode. It's a little bit smoother. And if we crank this threshold down, that sounds familiar, right? Okay, so that's using sidechain as an effect because, you know, you can obviously hear it. It's night and day. And then with it. So I just wanted to be clear that that method exists. But the other method of sidechaining, and the one that I mainly use, is using it without it being noticeable. And usually you sidechain your bass to the kick drum, but you want to do it in a way to where you're not hearing it. It's not an effect. It's supposed to be kind of sneaky and transparent. So I have this little loop. Here's my bass line right here. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put a compressor on the bass. Put it in sidechain mode, audio input from kick 9, RMS, ratio infinite, attack all the way down. And then when I start to pull this threshold down, and you can see the gain reduction right here where every time this kick drum hits, the volume of the bass is ducking and then coming back up real quick. But with this, you can't really notice it. And that is a very basic side chaining of the bass line to the kick drum. And we're going to come back to side chaining because it's going to factor in to some of these other things. All right, number 4. It's really important to keep your bass frequencies in mono, usually somewhere around 150 hertz to 200 hertz down. I would highly recommend keeping that in mono, and then from about 200 hertz up, let that be in stereo. I do want to clarify that the word bass kind of means different things. So when we say the word bass, we could be talking about bass frequencies, which bass frequencies technically start around 250 hertz, somewhere around in there, and go all the way down. So this right here is bass frequencies. But when we talk about a bass instrument, like an electric bass, or like a synth bass, bass instruments have frequency information across the whole EQ spectrum. So there are treble frequencies in a bass guitar. So I just wanted to clarify, when I say keep your bass in mono, I don't mean throw your whole electric bass guitar in mono or to throw your whole synth bass in mono. I mean put the bass frequencies in mono. Does that make sense? All right, so let's look at this dubstep bass line. When we say that bass frequencies are about 250 hertz down, this is what this bass line would sound like if we cut from 250 on down. So obviously a lot of this, exists all the way up through the EQ spectrum. What I like to do is to take a stereo tool, and this is a free one right here by Flux. I'm going to roll off all the high end and see what it looks like on the stereo tool. And that is really bad. That is our low end jumping all over the place, and it's like it can't find a home. So I'm going to use another plugin. This is A1 Stereo by Alex Hilton. The most important part of this plugin is right here, the safe bass mode and this frequency knob. So when the safe bass mode is on and this is set to 200 hertz, everything from 200 hertz on down is going to be in mono. So if I hit play now, watch our stereo tool. Now our low end is in mono. And if I turn this EQ off, now we have that whole big full bass sound, and the treble and the high end of the bass is still in stereo, but from 200 hertz down, all the bass is in mono, and that's going to make it sound way, way better in the mix. All right, next we're going to talk about layering, and this one is super important as well. I have this bass line pulled up. And this bass line has sub-frequencies, mid, high, it has the whole spectrum. And what I want to do is I want to separate the sub-frequencies from the rest of it, and that way I have separate controls over the top end of the bass sound and separate controls over the bottom end of the bass sound. So the first thing to do is to take an EQ, and I'm going to roll it off to around right here. And I'm going to take these MIDI notes and I'm going to copy them onto a sub instrument. I'm using hip hop sub bass inside of Ableton, but it's just a sine wave. You can use anything. So I'm going to copy these notes to this, and it sounds like this. You probably need headphones. So now together we have the whole bass line. And this is advantageous for like a couple reasons. One, now you might want the bass line to be a little bit louder, but you might have the sub frequencies where they need to be, so you can just crank up the top end and leave the sub alone. Also, when it comes to side chaining, I have a kick drum here. Let's turn off this sub and let's go back to just having one single bass line and forget this sub exists. If I just had this bass line on this one track and the kick drum, if I were to side chain this to the kick drum, it would sound like this. It's way too noticeable. And it's taking the punch away. So let's turn this off and get rid of this. But when I roll off the EQ and add a separate sub channel, if I just side chain the sub bass to the kick drum, then it sounds like this. You can see our gain reduction right here. So now we're side chaining the sub frequencies to the kick, but we're leaving the rest of the bass line alone on the top end, and then that makes the side chaining more transparent, and it sounds like the bass is really cutting through the mix because it's only the sub frequencies that are ducking in and out on the volume. Also, like we were just talking about, I could put the stereo control on the sub, and I'm just going to turn this stereo width all the way down and make sure that this sub is completely in mono. And with the top end, I could actually push that out further into the stereo field if I wanted to. This is another cool little free plugin called Wider by Polyverse. So I can, you know, I can push this top end on out into the stereo field, and that's another great thing about having these layered is the sub is just straight up in mono and you just leave it alone, and it gives you a little bit more freedom to get creative and, you know, with effects and stuff on this top end. Yeah. Alright, so next up we have converting to audio. And I think this is extremely helpful because I like to use MIDI a lot. Like right here, I'm using Serum for my bass, and I'm using Simpler for my kick. But I can't really see what's going on. I just see these MIDI blocks. So what I'm going to do is duplicate both of these. And I'm going to tuck one pair away here for safekeeping. Because, you know, once you convert to audio and start doing stuff, you can't really go back. So I like to save these just in case. But now with my bass line, I'm going to freeze and flatten. And with my kick drum, I'm going to freeze and flatten. And now let's zoom in here and really take a look. So we see the kick drum here. It's a nice short kick. And so here's like the main punch of the kick right here at the very, very beginning. And then here's the body. So we can literally just grab the fade on the bass and just kind of do one of these. This is sort of also like sidechaining. It's just like a manual version of it. And I'll do that here too. And so this note right here, there's no kick drum at the same time, so I'll just leave that alone. And let me do that here. And there's no kick drum for this bass note, so I can leave that alone. And there's no kick drum on this bass note, so I can leave that alone. So yeah, so now we have... And it's just a really quick and easy way to kind of do a manual sidechain. And sometimes that gets better results. I always recommend converting to audio so you can just literally get a look at what's going on. And that's going to lead right into our next section, which is know what kick drum to use. When you're making different genres, you want to have an idea of what kind of kick drum you need ahead of time. For instance, a dubstep kick drum would sound like this. It's real short, it's really heavy. There's a whole lot of mid-range and a whole lot of high-end. That one even sounds like it's got like a hi-hat and a couple other things layered in with it. If you're going to do like a modern hip-hop trap kind of beat, you'd want a punchy kick, but not so much top end, more like this. If you were going for that like old school boom bap vinyl style hip hop, you would do a kick drum like this. You can hear that little vinyl crackle in there. Another thing is make sure your kick drum isn't actually your bass line. Like for instance, that's in a kick drum folder, but it's really sort of a kick and a bass stab. So you need to beware of stuff like that because you can't just use this as a regular kick drum. You pretty much just have to build your whole song around that bad boy. And then also, some kick drums have other instruments layered on top of them. For instance, this one. It has a tom layered over top of it. It almost sounds like a Timberland beat or something. Next, we have shortening your kick drum. And this kind of goes along with the whole converting to audio theory. Check out this kick drum right here. If you listen to this kick drum like over and over again, it's almost like it's doing two syllables. It's going boom, 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 boom. So if I was going to use this kick for like a heavy dubstep or a heavy bass music track, I want it short. I don't want it to do two syllables. I want it to do one sharp, short syllable. Because this is an audio sample, we can actually look at these wave cycles, and you can see the beginning right here. And then this happens, and then this happens. But you'll notice that the last few wave cycles are identical. So what I'm going to do is take out a few of those. So let's cut it maybe right here. And take it to about right here. And you're just going to want to line this up. That's looking pretty good right there. I'm going to change my curve here to this little crossfade. And let's hear what this sounds like. That sounds pretty good, and it's a lot shorter, and it's one syllable now. So we start it with this. Boom. And end it with this. And if you think about this in regards to sidechain, you want the sidechain to be sneaky and unnoticeable, so the shorter the kick drum is, the less amount of time the volume is going to be dipping down on your bass. All right. So next up, I want to talk about hard-hitting bass. Basically ways to get your bass to thump harder or knock harder or whatever adjective you want to use. A couple weeks ago, I made a video all about 808s. If you want to check that out, there's a part called Enhancing 808s. That kind of shows you what I'm going to touch on right here, which is a lot of times you can make bass sound punchier and thumpier, not by turning up the bass, because that'll screw up your mix, which is sort of the whole point of this. But a lot of times if you just excite the mid-range and the treble with some kind of distortion or saturation or something, it can make the bass hit a lot harder, and it's almost like an auditory illusion or something. It feels bassier, but really all you've done is added stuff to the top end. Like here's an 808. I'm going to show you two different ways to excite the top end of an 808. First is this plugin called RC20 Retro Color. This plugin does a lot of things. It's kind of made to make things sound retro and warbly and warped and stuff like that. But just this distortion unit is really cool because you can select what frequency range you want to add distortion to. So I can kind of just do from maybe like 288 up to about like 6K or something like that. And it sounds like this. Here's without it. And here's with it. And just to give you a nice free option, this is the saturation knob by Softtube. And this saturation plugin just has two controls. There's just a dry wet. And this is the cool part. If you leave it in neutral, it's going to add saturation to the whole EQ spectrum. If you put it on keep high, it's not going to add it to the treble. It'll just add saturation to the low end. But what we want is this keep low, meaning it's going to leave the low end alone and leave the sub frequencies untouched. And it's going to add saturation to the top end, which is what we just did with the other plugin. So I'm going to put it on keep low and crank it up about halfway. Here's without it. And then here's with it. And like if I turned it on keep high, listen to how bad that sounds. Even neutral sounds bad. Because all that distortion is getting added to the subs. But with this one, you can throw it on this keep low and add some instant power to your bass lines. Alright, and for number 10, this is a little technique called the Switcheroo. But really, the point of this is to inspire you to get creative. Like I said earlier, every song is different, every genre is different, and this is just one little example of a way you can kind of get creative with how you manage your low end. This is a song called Yeah that I just put out not too long ago. Basically what I did, you have the intro here. And then you have the drop. What I did on this is on the intro, I left the kick drum alone for the most part, and it's really bassy and really subby. And then I duplicated that channel, and on the other kick drum, I rolled off most of the low end, and that's the kick drum that's going to go over top of this 808. So when you listen to the intro and then the build up and the drop, it doesn't sound like the kick drum switches, but it does, and it's nice and transparent. Alright everybody, that wraps it up for today. Thank you so much for watching again. Please leave a comment, let me know what you'd like me to make a video on. Peace.